that looked like it hurt. You know that guy's on the way to the doctor. But what about for less serious-looking head injuries? Today on Clubhouse Gas, we're going to find out what a concussion is, what signs to look for, and how to treat them. Today I'm here with friend of the show, Dr. David Marshall, Director of Sports Medicine at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Welcome back, Dr. Marshall.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So, of course, we're now in the middle of football season. It's well and alive, and you're watching those guys, and they are just getting knocked down time after time. And our first thing here today is, how common is it for them to be getting the concussions?
Well, unfortunately, concussions are a lot more prominent than we thought. You know, back in the olden days, a concussion was defined as losing consciousness. If you didn't lose consciousness or didn't get knocked out, then you probably didn't have a concussion. And nowadays, that is just not true. The kid's severity of a concussion can range anywhere from just kind of feeling in a fog for a brief period of time, such as seconds, to getting knocked out and having to be rushed to the hospital. One of the terms that was used long ago, and still sometimes now, is the bell ringer. That coaches or kids will say, no, I've never had a concussion, but I've got my bell ring 12 times. And a bell ring or getting dinged definitely is a concussion.
Okay, so what are some of these symptoms we want to look for?
Well, the most common symptom that a kid that's concussed will have is a headache. About 2/3 to 3/4 of them will complain of a headache, usually shortly after the injury and sometimes lasting weeks, sometimes months, called the post-concussive syndrome. Other ones are feeling slowed down. I've heard kids describe it's like being from a Pentium 5 to a Pentium 2. They just seem to process information at home and school a lot slower. They feel like they're in a fog. They might feel dizzy or lightheaded at times. Bright lights and loud noises will bother them. They have trouble processing math or trouble doing calculations or concentrating on their homework. They just feel like they're not quite right. Oftentimes difficulty sleeping. These kids have trouble sleeping at night because of the way that they feel.
So these symptoms can last for a while post-game.
They can last, like I said, minutes, and they can last weeks or sometimes months.
Okay, so say you're the coach, the parent, you've noticed some of these symptoms. They're dizzy, they're having a hard time focusing. What are kind of the steps you want to take if you're noticing this in the kid?
Well, the first thing you need to do is make sure that kid gets taken out of the game. You certainly do not want to take an athlete whose brain is still trying to recover from a concussion and send them back out into the game and get a second concussion. That can be really devastating. That can lead to death. There's a thing called the second impact syndrome, and that is probably the main thing that we're doing to try to prevent problems with concussion. We try to prevent the second impact syndrome. If you ever hear the tragic event where a boxer on TV gets knocked around, they get up and then they wind up dying in the ring or in the ambulance ride on the way to the hospital, they die, that's because of second concussion syndrome. Their brain was unable to recover completely before it suffered another blow, and this is what we need to prevent with all athletes.
So whether they just got their bell rung, even if it looks like, a very slight head injury, it's absolutely imperative. Do they see their doctor? What do you recommend? Well,
that depends. Years ago, we would class concussions based on grades. The most simplest classification was grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. A grade 1 concussion was where your symptoms lasted for 15 minutes and they completely went away. The doctors on the sidelines, the athletic trainers on the sidelines have a battery of tests that they put these athletes through. If they pass the test and the symptoms don't recur and they have normal memory, they can process, they can do simple math, they remember everything around the time of the injury, and then with exertion, they still don't have return of symptoms, we'll let that athlete go back. That was termed a grade 1 or a mild concussion. Or you might have an athlete whose symptoms persist for over 15 minutes, and that athlete cannot go back to play, and oftentimes they require medical clearance from their doctor to determine return to play. Nowadays, it really doesn't matter what grade it is. We're learning that maybe memory loss or losing the memory of the details around the time of the injury, that might be more important than loss of consciousness. And it's kind of hard to determine that with an athlete, especially if you don't see them all the time or don't know them. So really the important thing is recognize that the athlete isn't functioning properly, they just don't feel right, they don't look right, label them as having a concussion, and then hold them out until all symptoms clear, whether it's within minutes or within days, hours, or weeks.
Okay, and then finally, in terms of prevention, what can coaches or parents or even athletes themselves do?
The first key to prevention with concussions is you have to recognize it. And of course, we can't prevent all concussions in sports that are collision sports, such as football and soccer, lacrosse, ice hockey, where collisions are part of the game. You can't prevent them all. You can't prevent ankle sprains. You can't prevent all collarbone fractures, and you can't prevent concussions. What we need to do is educate people at all levels, from the athletes to the coaches to the trainers to the doctors to the administrators to the parents. Everybody needs to be aware that these mild forms of head injuries are indeed concussions. So educating athletes and teams at all levels is the first step. Kids need to understand, and coaches need to understand, that if you're still having signs and symptoms of a concussion, even if they seem mild, you really should not return to play. You can certainly put yourself at a higher risk of suffering another concussion with a lesser blow. The symptoms are going to last a lot longer if you don't fully recover. The effects of a concussion might be cumulative. In other words, these athletes that suffer multiple concussions might actually be losing brain power. They might be actually losing IQ points in the long run. That research is still underway, but these are all concerns that we have about kids going back too soon that have been concussed.
What about some kind of protective headgear?
Yeah, of course, some sports require headgear, such as football and ice hockey and things of that, like those sports, they require them. And the headgear always seems to be ever-changing. It seems like every year or two, the football helmets change their shape. They change the padding. Nowadays, they have air cells in the helmet to provide a nice cushion of air around the brain to help protect it. There's been some talk about youth soccer players wearing headgear to prevent heading a heavy leather ball. Even rugby players, they're starting to wear headgear now to provide a little bit of padding around the head, maybe to decrease the risk of a concussion.
Now, in addition to the protective headgear, of course, you've got the mouthpieces,
Right.
and kids are always complaining about wearing these. But do they need to be?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of research that's ongoing to determine whether or not mouthpieces prevent concussions, or whether a good mouthpiece versus a not very well-fitting mouthpiece, does it prevent concussions. And I think the research is still out. I haven't seen any evidence that says mouthpieces definitely prevent concussions. One thing that we know prevents concussions is tensing up the neck muscles and kind of holding your head in place. In other words, if you look at two receivers, one of them going across the middle, both of them going across the middle, one of them sees the hit coming and the other one doesn't see the hit coming, even though the collisions are just as violent in the same place. It's the athlete that doesn't see the hit coming that's more likely to get a concussion. And the reason is, if you don't see the hit coming, you don't have time to tense up your muscles, to tighten your neck muscles, to clench your teeth, because if you do that, when you take the blow, your head doesn't accelerate. The brain doesn't accelerate inside your skull, and that lessens the likelihood of a concussion. So the athlete that doesn't see it coming has much more of a whiplash type injury, where the brain inside the skull rattles and maybe bruises itself when it hits the side of the head. So we think mouthpieces help protect the dentition or the teeth when kids clench their fist and tighten up to tighten up all their muscles in the head and neck to brace for the collision. And another thing that's kind of new nowadays is there's neurocognitive testing that kids can do. One thing that we recommend is the athlete takes these tests before the season starts, called a baseline or a pre-test, so we can see how they function normally, and then when they get concussed, they can take a series of tests at day 3, day 5, day 7, day 14 until they completely resolve, and that way we can check how their brain is actually functioning. It's a 28-minute test on the computer that tests memory, processing speed, spatial arrangements, problem solving, and we can get a pretty good idea of how this kid's brain is functioning. So we're recommending that kids have a pre-test and then have access to that testing after they do suffer a concussion, if they do.
All right, so we've got the pre-testing, we got some protective gear, and most importantly, just monitoring these kids.
We just need to educate. People need to be aware that when you have a decrease in your ability to process from blow, that is a concussion.
Well, we thank you for educating us here today.
Thank you.
And we'll talk with you again
Thanks.
soon. All right, and thank you for watching this edition of Clubhouse Gas. We'll see you next time.